This video is brought to you by Patreon. Patreon! See how the stars live. As Nickelodeon entered its third post-Cy Schneider year, it was becoming very clear what was staying and what was going. The less entertaining, purely educational material was gradually bleeding off, and attempts to bring in new shows of that ilk, like National Geographic Explorer, failed to take off and was quickly abandoned. You Can't Do That on Television was still going strong, and was followed by multiple attempts at children's sketch shows, though the success of those programs, like Out of Control and Turkey Television, is debatable. And then there were the nature-themed adventure shows. These programs were never headliners. They weren't ratings winners, but in the days of Schneider, they were a much-needed palate cleanser from the green vegetable stuff. Children having adventures and lots of neat animal footage? Sign me up. And while a lot changed after Schneider's departure, these types of shows would never really go away, even into the 21st century. A supporting player, but a consistent one. And on November 1st, 1986, Nickelodeon introduced another entry into this secondary genre, a little show called Zoo Family.
This kids-only weekend on Nickelodeon, meet the Zoo Family.
Me, Tarzan. You, Jane.
The Zoo Family on the kids-only weekend on Nickelodeon.
David Mitchell, no, not that one, is the fictional head veterinarian of the very real Royal Melbourne Zoological Gardens in Australia, tending to all the animals, be they sick, injured, depressed, or horny. A widower, he lives on site with his two children, 13-year-old Susie and 15-year-old Nick, who are both very invested in the animals here and help out with zoo operations when they're not at school.
What happened to you?
Oh, nothing.
You look like you've been piling boulders.
That's after lunch. Oh, Jeff thinks the rocks in the elephant compound will look better stacked.
Are you helping him?
Yep.
Hey, I book you this week.
Sorry, Harry. It'll have to be next week. Bye.
Oh.
The problems the Mitchell family faces alternate between animal problems and people problems. When one of the mandrills passes away, Susie takes it upon herself to help nurse its baby, but struggles when time to separate the young animal from human care. Nick is trying to woo a girl from school, but she thinks animals are PU, and Nick has to pick a side. The zoo has to bring in a controversial celebrity animal rights activist to examine their elephant enclosure. Susie is smitten with the zoo's new employee and starts doing all of his work to impress him. Actually, a lot of Susie's plots involve her being boy crazy, and in one case, a boy being so crazy for her that he kidnaps a koala.
You took her.
I stole her.
Why?
Well, because I thought you'd like me more. Well, at least pay me more attention.
The Mitchells are practically family with the rest of the staff, which includes the zoo's director, Ken Bennett, who is constantly exasperated by the goings-on, student vet Julie Davis, who may have a bit of chemistry with David, no-nonsense zookeepers Peta and Harry, and all-nonsense zookeeper Andy, who likes to antagonize Harry over his thick accent.
If you took an oath from the Bible, I'd want to check if it was a forgery.
Pardon? You notice I never take offense at anything Harry says, because I can't understand a word of it.
A forgery.
Pardon?
While there is some playful ribbing and the occasional hurt feelings, the zoo staff are close and work together to solve the problem of the day. More often than not, that problem is Mr. Spencer, one of the zoo's main financiers, a millionaire aristocrat who is investing in the zoo despite not seeming to like zoos that much. A buffoonish, rich, borderline Cruella de Vil type, he is often trying to pull something like ban children from the zoo so they don't drive away the rich, distinguished guests, or kill all the sick animals so that they're no longer eating at the zoo's budget. Usually our protagonist will have to do some business gymnastics to outplay Spencer's maneuvers, which means we get a lot of scenes of adults sitting in an office and talking about finances.
I don't know why you're prevaricating. Any fool can see it's the only logical thing to do. And the brute's dangerous.
Well, I'm not arguing with you, Neil. I mean, frankly, I just don't know.
Well, you must know something about the breeding habits of pachyderms.
Well, there's not much available to know. In fact, there's a great lack of knowledge on the subject. I'd really like to get more expert advice.
Then we're wasting our time, aren't we? Or to pack it in right now and accept their offer, I say.
We'll give it serious thought.
Do.
Thrilling stuff. To counteract this, the show does dip its toe in some pretty silly plot lines. A fortune teller's dog runs away and hides in the zoo, and Spencer wants it caught and destroyed. So the kids hijack the zoo's speaker system and pretend to be ghosts to give Spencer a right fright.
Thomas Spencer!
Who is it?
We are watching you. We see every move you make.
Show yourself.
We are invisible. We are here to warn you.
Me?
You will not harm the dog or its beautiful owner.
I've never laid a figure on the old hag.
Oh, Mr. Spencer sure is a goof. Anyway, here's him being really racist.
The point is, don't get me wrong now, I'm not a racist, not in the least. It's simply there are far too many damn foreigners here.
Mr. Spencer, And
as for those girls, well, we don't want people waltzing around all day in fancy dress, do we? Well, that's all. Things to do. My point is this. The zoo attracts a lot of tourists, and they don't want to see the place run by people who can't even speak the Queen's English. So, I've come up with a solution.
which is?
A simple dictation test, of course, for all prospective employees. Good idea, eh?
This is from an episode where it's discovered that one of the zoo employees is an illegal immigrant, and the zoo family have to reconcile with what that might mean as the threat of deportation hangs over their heads. Being a family television show, it ends with their friend not getting deported, and baby animals! So cute! Animals are the best, aren't they?
Harry, get out! She's fighting us!
Help him! Somebody help him!
Down. Down. Down.
Yeah, zoo family can have tonal whiplash at times. Sometimes Mr. Spencer is an evil capitalist, sometimes he's an out-of-touch fuddy-duddy that you can actually be friends with. Multiple episodes deal with his relationship between him and his wife, including an entire episode on them renewing their vows. Stop it! I don't want to be sympathetic to this guy, he's a jerkface. Likewise, sometimes the animal plots are very serious and realistic. The animals don't always survive from their illnesses, and it gets pretty sad. And sometimes one of the apes has a silly little crush on David.
Where's your jacket?
Celeste got it.
What's happened?
I think she made a pass at me.
And then there's Tim. Tim is a main character. He shows up in the opening credits, but I cannot tell you what Tim is. I don't know why Tim is there. I don't know what he adds to the story beyond chaos and confusion. Technically, Tim's family also works at the zoo and lives on site, but this isn't clear for the longest time. Tim's parents only show up in one episode near the end of the series, so he seems like some kind of random street orphan freely wandering around the zoo. Unlike Nick and Susie, Tim doesn't help around the zoo, and instead climbs about the enclosures, playing make-believe.
Buenos dias!
None of this is appropriate behavior for a zoo, but while Tim may annoy some of the other characters from time to time, they just let him mess around in off-limit areas, harass guests, and occasionally destroy things. I can't confirm this, but the feeling I get from all of this is that Tim was originally written to be a far younger character. maybe 4 or 5 years old. But during development, they cast a 12-year-old actor without really changing anything about his character. He's treated like a little kid, he behaves like a little kid, and he's forgiven for his actions because he's theoretically too young to know better.
Watson, the world-famous cheetah tamer, leaps into the tree. Savage wild cheetahs snapping and snarling just below him. And across the savannah, the chief headhunter approaches, spear in hand. He spies his quarry. Watson crouches. Muscles of steel. He springs over the cheetahs in one mighty bound and sprints for the only escape route.
I'm hard-pressed to say why Tim is even on this show. I would at least understand trying to appeal to a preschool demographic if the character was as young as he acted, but as is, he's a story element that conflicts with the show's more grounded elements. And that'll sometimes generate a B-plot, but sometimes it'll just be weird and off-putting. Put that gun down, young man! Who gave you such a realistic-looking toy gun? I'm gonna give them a piece of my mind. Zoo Family was originally produced for Australia's Channel 9 by Crawford Productions. Founded in 1945 by brother and sister entrepreneurs Hector and Dorothy Crawford, Crawford Productions was originally in radio production until regular television broadcasting was introduced to the country in 1956. The company was one of the early success stories for Australian television, which would be dominated by English and American imports for the first couple of decades. For example, Crawford Productions produced Australia's first sitcom, Take That, in 1957. And then there was Homicide, one of Australia's first dramas and an answer to Dragnet, beginning in 1964. And there was 1974's The Box, a soap opera with nudity. They could do that over there. That became Australia's second most popular show for that year. A lot of success over the decades, a lot of cop shows, a lot of soap operas, but one thing they didn't have a lot of was family programming. There had been an attempt in 1976 with a program called Solo One, which sounds like a Disney Plus Star Wars show, but was just another cop show with more family-friendly storylines, and it failed to find an audience. Then in 1985, Crawford Productions opted to step up their family programming game with a 1-2 punch. The first punch was The Henderson Kids, about 2 teenagers who have to move to the country after their mother dies in a car crash. And the second punch was Zoo Family, also about 2 teenagers with a dead mom. Crawford Productions liked to repeat themselves. This wasn't even their first show with a veterinarian main character. There was the country town vet drama Young Ramsey, running between 1977 and 1980. Of the 2 shows, The Henderson Kids would prove to be the ultimate winner, getting a second season, some Australian television awards, and home video releases. Premiering in June of 1985, Zoo Family's single 26-episode season came and went on Australian TV without much fanfare. But one thing Zoo Family had over the Henderson Kids was greater international appeal. Filming in the real-life Royal Melbourne Zoological Gardens with the zoo's actual animals made it a unique product with some educational value. And Crawford Productions was already trying to sell the show overseas before the production was even finished. Said production went pretty smoothly, all things considered, despite it being very red light, green light to accommodate the zoo's operations. They didn't shut down the zoo for filming, and often had to work during open hours, including special events like Pensioner Week, when the zoo was free of charge for senior citizens. And of course you had the animals, which always runs the risks of unpredictable behavior. We have to work out the feeding times of each animal and try not to disturb them, and animals and children can be difficult. Working with them is not always easy. The gorillas loved it. Well, some of the gorillas. One was so excited or frightened by the sight of the camera that she had diarrhea. But Rigo, the male gorilla, loved it and pursed his lips at the camera. Notable members of the cast included Peter Curtin as Dr. Mitchell, who had done secondary and guest parts in many of Crawford Productions' police procedurals, and was now being given his own show. Susie was played by Kate Gorman, and shortly after this show wrapped up, she was cast as another Sue in what would eventually become one of Australia's most internationally well-known shows, the soap opera Neighbours. The biggest name in the main cast would be Rebecca Gibney, who played Julie Davis. Zoo Family was early in her career, but it was soon followed with a reoccurring role in Crawford Productions' next project, The Flying Doctors, which would prove to be hugely successful. With that career boost, Davis would end up in the lead role of the 90s crime series Halifax FP and the 2000s drama Packed to the Rafters. But the biggest name to ever be on Zoo Family wasn't one of the regulars, but one of the guest actresses. In the episode Yvonne the Terrible, Nick and Susie are tasked with watching over a foster kid for the weekend, a troubled youth. Do you recognize her? Probably not, with her this young and the puffy brown hair, but that's future pop star Kylie Minogue.
I don't like being treated like a charity case. How come these hippos aren't in together?
They don't get along.
Who does?
People. Sometimes.
I hadn't noticed.
Speaking of pop stars, Susie likes to coat her room with posters, which brings us to something that makes this show a bit more enjoyable to watch today than it would have been back then. Zoo Family is super 80s. How 80s is it? This 80s. The product placement in this show is thick. Puma bags, Coke cans, Garfield t-shirts, a Skeletor just hanging from the roof, posters for Indiana Jones and Gremlins. Much of the enjoyment for modern viewers is picking out all the 80s Easter eggs in the background. There's even an entire episode dedicated to Dungeons and Dragons, with kids running around the zoo with a giant novelty D12.
O guardians of light, please give thy servants protection from unseen forces of evil.
My friends can see me now, I just die.
Their eyes are now covered.
This is neat, not only because D&D is neat, but because this was filmed in the middle of America's satanic panic, where clueless adults thought Dungeons & Dragons was a gateway into cults and satanic worship. Tom Hanks was in a movie about how evil D&D is just a few years prior to this show. While that wasn't a big worry in Australia, this was a show being sold on the international markets. No doubt there was a discussion on if this episode about Dungeons & Dragons would hamper their ability to sell the show in the States. Unfortunately, all this Dungeons & Dragons stuff happens in what I feel to be the show's worst episode, called Way of the Bison. In this episode, we're introduced to Lisa, a girl suffering from a spinal injury that makes it hard for her to walk and stand for long stretches of time. She's due to have a surgical operation, but there's a risk of extreme disability if something goes wrong. So she spends her days by herself near the bison enclosure, relating to these endangered animals. This gets the attention of the kids and the staff, and Tim has to stick his nose where it doesn't belong.
Now will you leave me alone?
No, you need friends. Everyone does.
I don't need anyone. And most of all, I don't need a brat like you asking nosy questions.
Come on, Tim.
This is one of those moments where it would make much more sense if Tim was 5 instead of 10, 11, 12, when poking into other people's businesses would be seen as more acceptable, and him getting teary-eyed when a woman tells him to leave her alone would be a much more balanced reaction. Everyone coddles Tim like he's an infant, and when Julie Davis gets wind that one of the zoo guests hurt this rude child's feelings, she goes off.
Look, you really upset that little boy. Is that how you get your kicks?
They asked questions.
Don't blame me if they didn't like the answers.
I was only being honest.
Why don't you try being honest with yourself?
I don't have to put up with this.
Look, we all felt sorry for you. We all understand that you're scared about your future. But just because you've decided to wallow up to your ears in self-pity, don't take it out on our kids, all right?
This sucks. The episode is basically going, how dare you be disabled and depressed? Don't you dare be an inconvenience to us able-bodied people. Lisa isn't going out of her way to upset anyone. She isn't using her disability as an excuse to be abusive. She is dealing with weighty emotional issues. And a bunch of strangers walk up to her, demand she answer personal questions, and then gets yelled at for not smiling like a champ. Julie does apologize for her tone, but Lisa is also like, no, you're right, I shouldn't be such a Debbie Downer, I'm sorry. Again, not that this would excuse Julie's behavior, but these events would make much more sense if Tim was in preschool and not the 6th grade. And this is beside that point, but the episode is clearly setting up Lisa joining Nick's little D&D party, as she is also a fan of the game.
You're into Dungeons and Dragons, aren't you? I got into it at university. Takes brains. Who's the dungeon master?
Me.
What module are you doing?
Module? Adventure. The Quest of the Blue Rose.
Hidden in the slave pits of the Undercity.
That's the one. Andrew's my assistant.
Let me know how it goes. I could use the company.
And you think, okay, she plays D&D with the main characters, this lets her come out of her shell a bit. But instead, Nick makes her the sleeping damsel that has to be awoken by the heroes. Basically, the characters take this disabled girl and makes her into a prop. Just sit here and look pretty. This is a very, very poorly conceived episode. None of the other episodes get nearly this bad, but none of them really excel either. I wouldn't personally rate any episode of Zoo Family higher than a B+. And I don't seem to be alone, because Zoo Family has had no staying power over the years. There doesn't seem to be a lot of wistful nostalgia going around for this program. There's virtually no presence on home video, no internet retrospectives or look-backs with the press. The Wikipedia page is sparse and claims the series was based off a book by Robin Klein, which is not true. But perhaps the most damning thing is that, as of this writing, the entire series is on YouTube. These videos have been up for 4 years, and most of them have about, 50 views. Not 50,000, 50. The most views I've seen on a Zoo Family episode is 600. This episode of Knacks is destined to be the most watched Zoo Family product in decades. I wish I could turn this around and say that Zoo Family is a lost masterpiece, but it's ultimately decent but not amazing family television, elevated by the fact that it was filmed in a real zoo for real. Which is the hook that Nickelodeon bit down on. Zoo Family may have had a mediocre writing, but its intimate look at zoo operations made it a one-of-a-kind piece. Kids love animals, and zoos. In this series, the zoo is a rich and often unpredictable environment for drama and fun. Zoo Family offers Nickelodeon viewers a chance to see a zoo from the inside out. And you know, that's the real trick of it. Zoo Family ran for 2 years on Nickelodeon, largely ignored until phased out in September of 1988. But maybe we shouldn't think about it in terms of mass appeal. Let's ignore the hundreds of thousands of people who watched it in Australia and in America and promptly forgot about it, and instead focus on that 100 or so kids who saw this show about the inner workings of a real zoo and decided, that's what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be a zookeeper. I want to be a vet. I want to work with endangered animals. Zoo Family is decent but not great family drama, but as a point of inspiration to just the right impressionable youth, Zoo Family is on fire.
Nick, 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 Nickelodeon. Nick, 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 Nickelodeon.
Next time, there sure are a lot of movies in theaters. It's so hard to pick something to watch. If only we had the recommendations of children who don't know anything about movies. I don't really have a research shout out this time. I would love to know more about Zoo Family's production, but outside of one small news article from 1985, I couldn't find much out there. This is a show trying very hard to be forgotten, so instead I'll point you to the Crawford Productions website. The company has since stopped making television shows and instead focuses on selling their old shows on DVD. Not Zoo Family, of course, but if you'd like to walk along a vertical slice of Australian television history, you can at least browse their catalog. Thank you all for watching. If you'd like to support Knacks and other Pop Arena projects, consider contributing to my Patreon. Every dollar goes to research materials, production values, and hair ties. You can also support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, hitting that bell icon for notifications, leaving a comment, sending a one-time donation through Ko-fi or PayPal, following me on Twitter, and sharing Knacks with all your friends. I'll see you next time.